Open the freezer, look inside, count how many days of actual food you have sitting in there. Now, imagine the grid goes down tonight and does not come back for 3 weeks. Gone. By day 4, every piece of meat you paid for is already rotting in the dark. The smell reaches the hallway by day 6. You spent $200 filling that freezer, and one event erased every bit of it. I spent months digging through preservation records from the 1930s and further back than that, going through agricultural extension bulletins, farmhouse household surveys, French culinary archives, military quartermaster logs. What I found was not just old, it was technically superior in every way that matters for long-term food security. A $2 ingredient, rendered from the animal itself, that creates a physical oxygen barrier around cooked meat and stops spoilage at the biological source. Not slows it, stops it. Meat preserved this way has been confirmed viable at 18 months, at 3 years. At 5 years in historical accounts, detailed enough to read like engineering documentation. Without a single watt of electricity, without a freezer, without a power bill, without a grid that can fail on you overnight. If that kind of buried knowledge matters to you, subscribe and share this right now. Because almost nobody you know has heard of this, and they should. Let me take you to where this actually begins. Not the 1930s. Further, ancient Rome. Roman military quartermaster records from the 1st century document cooked meat preserved and rendered fat for long-distance campaign supply, stored in sealed clay vessels for over a year in field conditions. The physics were fully understood long before the vocabulary existed. Fat is an oxygen barrier. The bacteria responsible for putrefaction require oxygen to survive and multiply. Seal cooked meat completely beneath rendered fat, and you remove the biological mechanism of decay entirely. Not suppress it. Remove it. The Romans called it conserva. They documented storage durations exceeding 12 months in conditions far harsher than your basement. This was not folk magic or tradition handed down without understanding. It was applied biology running 2,000 years before the word biology was ever written. The French refined it into a technical art form. By the 18th century, the method they called confit had become one of the most precisely documented food preservation systems in the world. Duck, goose, pork, cooked slowly in their own rendered fat, packed into earthenware crocks, sealed beneath a layer of the same fat, stored in a cool cellar. The documented storage life of properly prepared confit in 18th century French farmhouses was 18 months to 3 years. This is not something historians dispute. It is recorded in household management literature of the period with the specificity of a craft guild manual, weights of fat to meat, temperatures of the render, the exact depth of the fat seal required for reliable preservation, signs of successful preservation versus failure. These people were not experimenting. They were executing a system that had been refined through generations of precise observation. The same method crossed the Atlantic in the early 1800s, and by the 1930s, during the Depression, when a family's ability to preserve its own protein was the difference between eating and not eating. The lard crock was as common in an American farmhouse kitchen as the stove itself. I found household surveys conducted by Agricultural Extension Services in 1932 and 1933. They documented the method in specific detail, families rendering their own lard after the hog slaughter. Using it to preserve pork, chicken, and rabbit through the winter months without refrigeration, without electricity, without anything the modern food system tells you is essential, and eating safely from those crocks 8, 12, 18 months later. The knowledge was precise. The results were reliable. And then something happened that had nothing to do with food science, something that changed every kitchen in this country within a single generation. The chemistry. First, because I want you to understand exactly why this works before I show you what buried it. When meat spoils, it does so through 2 distinct biological mechanisms: bacterial growth and oxidation. Bacteria that cause spoilage require 3 conditions to survive and multiply: moisture, temperature above 40 degrees, and oxygen. Seal cooked meat beneath rendered fat, and you address the oxygen problem completely and permanently. Fat is hydrophobic. It repels water, and it is physically dense enough to block gas exchange at the surface. A proper fat seal creates an environment below it where oxygen concentration drops to near zero within hours of sealing. Without oxygen, the aerobic bacteria responsible for putrefaction cannot multiply. The preservation is not chemical. There is no additive, no preservative, no synthetic compound involved. The fat is not adding anything to the meat. It is removing the biological prerequisite for decay. The second mechanism is oxidation, the chemical degradation of the fat in the meat itself. Rancidity. And here's what I found in the research that surprised me most. Properly rendered lard, stored correctly, does not go rancid for years. The natural antioxidants present in animal fat, tocopherols, naturally occurring vitamin E compounds, protect the fat from oxidation far longer than the food industry's public narrative suggests. A 1957 study in a food science journal confirmed that properly processed pork lard showed no significant oxidative rancidity at 12 months under cool storage conditions. 12 months of stability, no refrigeration, no preservatives, no synthetic additive of any kind. Now 1911. Because this is the year that changed every kitchen in America. A company released a product onto the American market made from cottonseed oil, a byproduct of the cotton industry that had previously been industrial waste. Through a process called hydrogenation, it was converted into a solid white fat that resembled lard in appearance and could be positioned as a modern alternative. The marketing campaign that followed was one of the most effective in food industry history. It positioned the new product as pure, modern, and scientific, and positioned lard, the fat that had kept American families fed through every crisis in the country's history, as old-fashioned, dirty, and unhealthy. I went through the trade publication records from the 1920s and 1930s. The shift in American kitchen fat usage in that period is dramatic. Lard consumption dropped by more than 40% between 1910 and 1940. And this happened not because science showed lard was harmful. The science did not show that. It happened because the vegetable oil industry invested heavily in a narrative that served its market position. Lard could not be patented. It came from hogs. Anyone could render it themselves. No company could own the supply chain. The hydrogenated vegetable shortening could be manufactured at industrial scale, branded, packaged, and sold with the kind of profit margins that a commodity fat from a farm animal could never command. The agricultural surplus in cottonseed oil and later soybean oil created enormous financial pressure to find industrial markets for these materials. Turning them into consumer kitchen fat was the answer, and the marketing investment required to make that transition happen was easily justified by the margin differential. The lard crock that had preserved American families for generations did not disappear because it stopped working. It disappeared because the industry that replaced it had the resources to make sure it looked obsolete. I want you to understand what was actually lost when that knowledge transfer broke down. The lard crock was not just a preservation method, it was a complete food security system. A family that maintained a properly managed crock of potted meat in their cellar had a guaranteed protein supply that was independent of every supply chain disruption, every price fluctuation, every grid failure, every store closure. That independence was not compatible with a food system built on recurring consumer purchase. Self-sufficient families buy less. Self-sufficient families are less profitable. The food security the lard crock represented was not a problem the industry needed to solve. It was a problem the industry needed to create. I put together the full documentation of this transition, along with the other preservation methods that were systematically replaced in the same period in the Century Pantry Blueprint. It is in the description if you want the complete picture, but stay here, because the method is coming next, and this is where it becomes something you can actually use this weekend. The method, exactly. Step by step, the way it was documented in the historical records I went through and the way I have verified myself in my own kitchen over the last 2 years. You need 3 things: good meat, rendered lard, glass jars or ceramic crocks with tight-fitting lids. Start with the lard. Rendering your own is not complicated. It requires pork fat, a heavy pot, low heat, and about 4 hours. The fat you want is called leaf lard. It comes from the kidney area of the hog. It is the cleanest, most neutral-flavored fat on the animal, and it produces the most stable rendered product. If you cannot find leaf lard, back fat works, and any independent butcher will have it. Ask. Most of the time, they sell it for under $2 per pound. Cut the fat into roughly 1-inch pieces. Place them in a heavy pot with half a cup of water. The water prevents scorching at the start of the render and evaporates as the fat liquefies. Heat on the lowest setting your stove allows. Do not rush this. High heat scorches the fat. Scorched fat produces off flavors that carry into the preserved meat. Slow and low is the only correct approach. After 2 to 3 hours, the fat pieces will have released most of their liquid. The remaining solid pieces are called cracklings. Strain the liquid fat through cheesecloth into a clean container. What you have now is rendered lard. Let it cool to liquid, but not yet solid. That is your preservation medium. Now the meat. Pork works best for this method, and the historical record is consistent on this: shoulder, leg, belly, any cut with reasonable fat content. Season the meat before cooking. Salt is essential here, and the ratio matters. 1 tablespoon of coarse salt per pound of meat at minimum. The salt works with the fat seal. It draws residual moisture from the meat surface and reduces the water activity inside the crock to a level where even the most resilient spoilage organisms cannot establish themselves. Cook the meat until fully done through. Internal temperature of at least 160 degrees. Let the cooked meat cool completely before packing. This step is not optional. Warm meat creates condensation inside the crock. Condensation introduces moisture beneath the fat layer. Moisture beneath the fat layer is how preservation fails. Wait until the meat is fully at room temperature. Then pack it tightly into clean, dry jars or crocks. No air pockets. Press the meat firmly and fill to within 1 inch of the top. Now pour the rendered lard over the packed meat. Pour slowly. Allow it to flow into every gap between pieces. Tap the crock gently to release any trapped air bubbles. Continue pouring until the fat layer above the meat is at least 1 inch deep. This is not negotiable. 1 inch minimum. Every surface of the meat must be covered with margin. Allow the crock to cool at room temperature. The fat will solidify into a firm white cap. That solid cap is the preservation seal. Store in a cool, dark location. A basement, a root cellar, a cool pantry. Consistent temperatures below 60 degrees are ideal. I have spoken with older farmers who stored crocks this way at 50 to 55 degrees and retrieved meat at 24 months with no off flavor, no discoloration, no sign of spoilage. 24 months. From a jar that required no electricity, no power bill, no replacement parts, and cost approximately $2 in lard per pound of meat preserved. To retrieve the meat, remove the fat cap with a clean spoon. Lift out what you need. Return the remaining meat. Remelt and repour the fat to reseal. The method is repeatable. The fat can be reused across multiple preservation cycles. You are not consuming the lard. You are maintaining a system. That distinction matters. Because a system that maintains itself indefinitely is fundamentally different from a product that runs out on a schedule. And a product that runs out on a schedule is exactly what the food industry needs you to be buying. I want to be honest about limits here. The lard crock requires cool storage conditions. In a modern home without a basement or root cellar, achieving the 60-degree or below temperature that optimizes long-term storage takes some planning. A cool pantry can work. A basement works best. Without cool, dark storage, the practical window shortens. 12 to 18 months is still realistic in conditions averaging 55 to 60 degrees. That is still 1.5 years of preserved protein from a $2 investment. Against nothing. If your freezer fails tonight, the economics. Let me be specific. A standard chest freezer costs $300 to $600 at purchase. It draws 100 to 200 kilowatt hours per month. At current average, residential electricity rates, that is $10 to $20 every single month, every year, for the 15 to 20 year lifespan of the appliance before it fails. Then you buy another one, and every load of food going into that freezer requires packaging. Plastic bags, vacuum seal rolls, all of it purchased and consumed and ultimately sent to landfill. Now contrast that with a ceramic crock or a glass jar. Initial cost of $2 to $8, operating cost of $0, power consumption of $0, maintenance of a monthly inspection, replacement schedule of essentially never. My great-grandmother had a ceramic crock she used through 30 years of preserving. The crock outlasted her. Over 10 years, a household shifting even 30% of its meat storage to this method saves $800 to $1,500 in electricity and packaging costs alone, not counting appliance replacement, not counting food lost to power failures. That is real money that left the household and never came back, because nobody showed them the alternative. There is one more thing I want to say before I close this vault, and I want to say it directly. What I am describing is not anti-modern. I'm not telling you to throw out your fridge or pretend the last century did not happen. What I am telling you is that the specific replacement of the lard crock with electrical refrigeration was a decision made for you by an industry, before you were born, before your parents were born, driven not by superior food safety outcomes, not by better nutrition, not by anything that served you, but by the simple fact that a method anyone can execute at home with fat from a butcher and a jar from a shelf cannot generate recurring revenue. And recurring revenue was what the industry was building. The people who knew this method did not fail to pass it on because it stopped working. They were told by television, by advertising, by the entire cultural apparatus of post-war consumer America that the new way was better. Some of them believed it. Some of them had no choice, as the old infrastructure, the root cellars, the smokehouses, the rendering kettles was designed out of new housing construction. The knowledge did not vanish. It survived in the farmhouses that stayed independent, in the extension records that nobody digitized, in the households of people who had every financial reason to stay self-sufficient, and in the agricultural bulletins from the 1880s and 90s that I have been going through for the last 2 years, which brings me to what comes next. Because what I found in those bulletins connects directly to where you would store these crocks, the root cellar, specifically to a humidity management method documented in agricultural bulletins from the 1880s, a passive system that maintains a root cellar at exactly the preservation conditions needed for long-term food storage, without electricity, without a dehumidifier, without anything that requires a power source or replacement parts. Built from materials available for under $20, that is what the next vault opens. The complete Century Pantry Blueprint, including this method, and everything else in the series, is linked in the description. And if you are here because someone shared this with you, subscribe now, because the next one is heavier than this one. Stay with us.